All right.
Got it.
We're going to wait another minute or two, see who else is going to jump on today. And then we've got a big, it's a big class. It's important stuff we're going to talk about today.
You have a tough competition tonight.
That's what Rona was saying. I said, no, it's not so tough.
We're here, aren't we?
They should
Yeah.
have been postponed it.
No, postpone that, not this.
I sent a note to President Biden. I said, we have the class tonight. Could you move it to another day? But he didn't.
Oh,
It's a few years precedence about this date, I think.
There were only 6
Okay.
people.
All right. We'll see who else is going to join us.
and we had to swallow the food, not chewing it, swallowing.
All right. Well, hello, Vard and Cheyenne. Hello, Shannon. Good to see you guys. All right. Courtney's coming in. Brian's here. It's a party. All right. Well, I think most people are here, so let's begin. What I want to do is really, last week we spoke about sort of the main difference, or one of the main differences between Judaism and Christianity, specifically as it relates to the Messiah and the concept of Messiah and Messianic age, and why it is that Jews don't believe that Jesus is or was the Messiah, any more than we believed that any of the other Messiahs that were out there were Messiahs. And so let's just kind of review that as we go into today. Right, the concept of the Messiah and the Messianic age is the same. I mean, it's something that we share. Christianity brings it from Judaism. We learned that the word Messiah really means the anointed one, and the Messiah will first be a descendant of King David, and second, most importantly, be a human being. It's one of the things that differentiates the Jewish concept of Messiah from the Christian concept of Messiah. Will be a political, spiritual leader, but will be human. And finally, will bring about the Messianic age, which consists of universal peace and all people knowing God, the bringing together of the Jewish people, the rebuilding of the temple, all of those things that we spoke about last week. And since none of those have occurred, we as Jews say, Messiah hasn't come yet. We say that the Messiah will come, if you remember, when either things are so bad or so good that the Messiah has to come, or at its proper time, there's a calendared time. Once again, Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah because the Messiah is a human being, not divine, and the Messianic age has not come. So any questions on that, what we talked about last week, before we dive into what I would call the other major differences between Judaism and Christianity? All right. So we're going to categorize these into large categories, and then we will drill down into them a little bit. The first major category is on the concept of the unity of God. Now, just before I came here, I was in the Beit Midrash. We had evening services. We were saying, for people who were saying Kaddish, and in the evening services, we recited the Shema, right? The Shema prayer comes from the book of Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is Echad. Now, that word Echad is an interesting word. We know it as a number. It's the number 1. But there's nuance to this word, and it can be used in different ways. We could say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is unique. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is whole or unified, right? This idea of the singleness of God is not just about the number of deities that we have. It actually goes into this conception of God as a whole, as unique, as complete. And if you remember when we spoke about God earlier on in the class, we talked about God as the Ein Sof, the infinite, the without end, that everything, right? God encompasses everything. So all of these are sort of a uniquely Jewish view of the divine. That God is one, is indivisible, is a whole, and can't be divided into different parts. Now, that is differentiated then with the concept of the Trinity, which is a fundamental Christian belief. And Christians, and it's a little different depending on which denomination you're in. Are you Catholic? Are you evangelical, in terms of exactly how the Trinity is seen? But God, which is one, because Christians are say they're monotheistic as well, but the Godhead, right? All three, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all are God, but they are also one. The three is one, but it's also three. So from a Jewish perspective, that is really problematic. It's really problematic. And in Christian theology, they have created ways to deal with that. But putting aside the problems that we have with the divinity of Jesus as a messianic figure, we have a problem with the divinity of Jesus as a differentiation or splitting of God, where God in a Jewish tradition is one. So that's issue number 1 with the Trinity. The other issue that we have with the unity of God versus Christianity is when you think about God from a Jewish perspective, it doesn't allow for any other forces. There are no other gods. There are no other forces that are outside of God's control. So when we start talking about Satan as a distinct and separate entity from God, right? Sort of working outside of God's control, working against God, that becomes problematic from a Jewish perspective. It creates a duality that we don't have within Judaism, and another distinction between God and what God can do. Now, what's interesting is that Satan is a Jewish concept as well. Satan comes from some of the books of the Bible that we use as well, most notably Job, but there are other places too. Satan in Jewish tradition, however, is not seen as running contrary to God's will, but actually is seen as being part of the process of executing God's will. Namely, we see Satan as the prosecuting attorney, which you're going to need, right? If you have a system of law, for example, like we have in the United States, you need a prosecuting attorney, you need a defense attorney. It doesn't mean that the prosecuting attorney is running against the wishes of the court. On the contrary, the prosecuting attorney is running under the rules that the court has set. But that prosecuting attorney has a job to do, which is adversarial, to the defendant. By the same token, Satan in Judaism doesn't run contrary to God, but is part of the process of ascertaining who we human beings are and what we've done and whether we've sinned or not and all those sorts of things. That's all part of the process. So that's issue number one, right? The question of the unity of God. Does anybody have any questions on that piece of it? Okay, I'm explaining it so well that there aren't any questions. This is complicated stuff, so if you have questions, please ask. All right. So the next category of differences is what I'm going to call free will versus original sin. Now, for anybody who studied Judaism, for anyone who looks at Judaism, you're going to see that free will is actually the basis of all of Jewish ethics. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, Torah is meaningless if we don't have free will. Because if we're all programmed, we don't need a guidebook. We don't need something to tell us how to live and what to do. It's pre-programmed. We have no ability to change it anyway, right? Torah only is useful if we have the ability to choose, and therefore now we have a guide to say, here's how to choose well. So we as human beings in the Jewish perspective have a choice. Are we going to do evil? Are we going to do good? And we have those choices multiple times, usually each day in our lives. But Christianity introduces the concept of original sin. And it goes back to the story of Adam and Eve, and when Adam and Eve ate from the tree that they were forbidden to eat from, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God was angry, and in that, God curses sort of Adam and Eve, and the punishment is that Eve is going to have pain in childbirth, and they were going to be kicked out of the Garden of Eden, because ultimately, you can't. There were two different trees in the garden. The tree of life, which allowed you to live forever as long as you're eating it, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And from a Jewish perspective, you can't eat from both, because then you would be God. So if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you can't live forever. You can't have access to the tree of life, which is why we were kicked out. Now, what's interesting, and some of you who have heard me speak about the Genesis story know that I believe the whole thing was a setup to begin with. I believe that we were supposed to eat from that tree and supposed to go out into the world, because again, it goes back to this concept of free will. Without the ability to choose between good and evil, there's no choice, and therefore we can't choose to have a relationship with God, and that is what God wanted, accepting the fact that we may choose not to. That's what free will means. So original sin comes in and says, wait a second, because of that first sin, every human being from that point on was tainted by this sin, which means that if you die with the weight of that sin on you and no way to get rid of it. So this then requires actually a very Jewish response. If you think about how do we, in the biblical world, right, how do we deal with sin? When we sin, we go to the temple, we bring an offering. If it was a little sin, we bring a little offering, a dove, maybe some grain. If it was a big sin, we bring a goat or a cow or an ox, right? Depending on how big the sin was. So what possible expiation could there be for the sin of all of humanity but the biggest sacrifice possible, and that would be God's Son. Which is why Jesus, by the way, is called the Lamb of God. Jesus is the sacrifice that allows for all of us to remove the taint of original sin and bring us back to neutral. Now, we could still do good things or bad things, and that's our choice in Christianity. We'll have to deal with that, right? That's why in the Catholic Church, if you sin, you go and you have to do confessional and things like that, right? That's why you still need to live a good Christian life if you are in the evangelical world. But that heavy taint that covers everything has been removed. In Judaism, we don't have the concept of original sin, and therefore the very purpose of Jesus is no longer necessary, other than to be the Messiah. Because a Christian would argue that Jesus is there to do two things. One, to be the messianic figure, which we dealt with already, but two, to act as our salvation, because otherwise we're doomed. But if we don't have original sin, we don't need to worry about that salvation. All we need to worry about is what we do, the choices that we make. We believe that children are born valence neutral. They haven't done good deeds, they haven't done bad deeds. And we're going to grow up and we're going to teach them, and they're going to start to do, and then they're going to create the life for themselves. And if they sin and they make mistakes, they're going to have to pay for that. They're going to have to go on Yom Kippur, and they're going to have to make atonement, and they're going to have to do all the different things that we do as Jews, because human beings are fallible. We get that. Nobody's perfect. But we're unencumbered by this original sin that in the Christian world weighs everybody down. The last piece that we have in Judaism, but Christianity takes a little different way when we talk about these ideas, is the idea of grace. Grace is the idea that in spite of the fact that we are undeserving, we still get a benefit. That's the grace. Now, we have grace within Judaism, but it's very different because from a Christian perspective, it's built into the very theology because of original sin and because Jesus is our salvation. It's built into theology in a different way than it is in Judaism. Judaism sees grace the same way that parents give grace to children. They're going to make a mistake. They're going to piss us off. All right, we're going to deal with it. And that's sort of the way that we understand it from a Jewish perspective. All right, any questions on free will versus original sin? So first, the first major difference that we talked about today was the unity of God versus the Christian Trinity or duality between Satan and God, good and evil. Both of those are problematic from a Jewish unity perspective. And the second now is Judaism is built on absolute free will. And we see free will as an absolute. You can't have a little bit of it. Either you have free will or you don't. And Christianity believes that we are weighted down by a sin that has nothing to do with any choices that we made. March. You have to unmute though, sorry. As soon as you're done talking, you'll get muted again. So yeah, you always have
Yeah, sorry.
to.
It doesn't pop up either. You gotta put it on. Anyway, I'm confused about grace.
Okay.
So what actually is, I mean, grace is like forgiveness, right? Is grace forgiveness?
Grace is an allowance. It is an acceptance of human beings as being sinners, and yet still God is going to be there for us, love us, care for us, and take care of us, in spite of the fact that we probably don't deserve it. That's grace. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Vard and or Cheyenne. I'm not sure which one of you is.
Um, sorry. I guess I had a question, kind of about the Satan,
Okay.
and I just don't really have any knowledge about that, and like, what is Satan in the Jewish religion?
As I said, Satan is seen, first of all, Satan is not a figure that we talk about very often, but Satan is seen as the prosecuting attorney.
Is it like a figure or like?
Yeah. It's a figure. It's part of the divine sort of court helpers in terms of that. We don't see Satan as an angel per
Like
se.
an angel? Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, we don't see Satan as an angel, but it's a divine being. It's not Satan's not human. But Satan isn't seen as an angel per se either.
I see.
Satan has a job to do. And it's
Okay.
actually called in Hebrew, it's interesting, it's Hasatan, which is not a proper name. So in Christianity, Satan is a proper name for a being. Hasatan just means the prosecutor.
I see. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Elliot.
Yeah, so two things. One, so when the Christians sit down to eat a meal and they say grace, they're doing what?
Same word, different usage,
Okay.
right? I mean, well, not entirely different, by the way. You know, we have food by the grace of God. And so
Right.
that's connected there. But saying grace it's a different usage of the word. Grace as a concept is love or favor being given despite not being worthy of it. And
Okay.
therefore it's done out of grace. Because if you're giving favor because they're worthy of it, that's a reward, actually. You think about it. And if you withhold your favor because they're not worthy of it, that's a punishment.
Right.
But there are times that we get a reward or a benefit even though we're not worthy of it. That's grace.
Okay. And the second thing is, when you think of Satan, think of hell, right? And so,
We're going to get to
oh, okay.
that.
Okay.
In
I'm leaving
other
that for our grand finale. But yes, we are going to get to it because heaven and hell is different. That's one of the major concepts that's going to be different.
Right. That was what I was wondering. So, okay.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah, but
wait.
we're going to talk about that. We got one thing I think before we get to that. Awesome. All right. So then our next major concept is what I would call faith versus law, right? Judaism is based on the idea of a covenant. Covenant means a promise. It's a relationship, right? There's a covenant of marriage. Man and woman promise to be there for one another. A covenant is just a promise. We made a promise to God. God made a promise to us. And there are numerous covenants that happened actually throughout our history. 3 major ones, right? The first was with all of humanity in the time of Noah. A covenant always comes with a promise and a sign. So the promise was that God was never going to destroy us again by flood. He had promised not by anything else, but by flood. And the sign was the rainbow, right? That was the sign of the covenant. Then he made a covenant with Abraham and said, Abraham, you are going to be the head of my people. There will be a great nation that comes from you. And the sign of the Abrahamic covenant is circumcision. Brit Milah. That's the sign of the covenant. The third covenant was with the entire Jewish people. We're going to read about it this week in synagogue, Parshat Yitro, the 10 Commandments. It's the covenant at Mount Sinai. And the sign was actually Torah. The Torah itself is the sign of the covenant between the people of Israel and God. So we as Jews, we're based on covenant. And when you make a promise to somebody, there are things that you promise to do. Rules, laws, right? That govern your relationship. I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. And so long as everybody does it, the covenant remains intact. So we as Jews are base ourselves on this idea of covenant. And the terms of the covenant ultimately are these laws and these mitzvot, these commandments that we do. That is how we relate to God, is through this idea of covenant, and the way that what governs the covenant are the commandments, are the laws, the mitzvot. But Paul came and changed Christianity forever. Remember, Christianity started as an offshoot from Judaism, and the early Christians were mainly Jews. Okay? But when Paul came, it's where we got a great divergence between Jews and what then became as Christians. And the reason Paul was doing it, he had a number of different political reasons, including the fact that he wanted to start to reach out to the non-Jewish population and bring them into Christianity. And if you say, hey, you have to get circumcised, you have to keep all these laws, all this sort of stuff, that's a tough sell, as it still is today, by the way, for many people. So what he argues is that law is no longer necessary. It's possible. You can still have a relationship with God vis-a-vis the law, but he actually says it's ill-advised. It's not, you shouldn't do it that way, because human beings are fallible. We're going to mess up. We're going to sin, and therefore we're going to get punished. What has come to replace law? The only path to salvation through Paul lies through Jesus. If you accept Jesus as the replacement for the relationship, for the covenantal relationship, then you can achieve salvation. Jews achieve salvation, whatever that means, which we'll talk about, through law, through the mitzvot. Christians don't follow the mitzvot. They achieve salvation through Jesus. That was a huge divergence, and ultimately created then a split between the Jewish community and Christianity. All right, so unity of God, free will versus original sin, faith and law. These are all big ideas, not to mention what we talked about last week. Number 4, let's talk about sin and atonement, right? There is a Jewish process when we sin for atonement. It's called teshuvah, it's called repentance, right, in Hebrew. You must atone according to Judaism. You must atone to God for any sins that are committed against God. But if you commit a sin against another person, then you need to go to them to atone. God cannot absolve you of a sin against another person. So if I go and I've hurt Katie's feelings, sorry, Katie, right? I need to go to Katie and say, I'm sorry, and make that right. How do we do that? It's actually a 4-step process. Now, if I've done something against God, I need to go to God. And that's what Yom Kippur is for. This 4-step process is basically, first, you have to acknowledge the fact that you've made a mistake. Actually, that's where most of us fail, right? We're unwilling to acknowledge even that we've made the mistake. But once you acknowledge it, then you need to go and try and ask for forgiveness. You need to make it right, right? So if you've stolen something from somebody, you can't atone for that while still keeping what you've stolen. Now, there's some things you can make right, and there are other things that that you can't make right. And the final step, at least according to Maimonides, is he argues that you don't really and truly atone until you are placed in the same situation and you make a different choice. That's when you know that true repentance and true atonement has happened. So in Christianity, while you can atone through mundane means, right? You can say, I'm sorry, you can do all those sorts of things. True atonement and forgiveness only comes through Jesus. And therefore, and Luther and some of the Protestant religions, denominations really struggled with this, right? You could be a horrible, awful person to everyone else around you, but if you believe in Jesus, you're going to heaven. And like I said, some of the Protestant denominations really struggled with this and said, wait a second, that doesn't seem right. And some of the denominations said, yeah, that's what it means, right? Belief in Jesus is that path that lets you go through. That is your means of atonement. And by the same token, you could be a great person, and if you don't believe in Jesus, you're still not going to be saved. Which brings us to the question of heaven and hell, because that is a major motivating factor within Christian theology and for Christians. Most religious Christians spend a lot of time thinking about their actions because they want to avoid hell. And from a Christian perspective, when you die, the place you go to is your eternal home. So if you go to heaven, you're going to have eternal bliss. If you go to hell, you're going to have eternal torment. And therefore, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. This is not, I'm going to go and it's going to be hard and I'm going to go, be there for a little bit and then I'm going to move on. From a Christian perspective, if you go to hell, you will be eternally damned. There is no coming back from that once you die. So let me say at the outset, there is absolutely no concept in Judaism of eternal damnation. It does not exist for us as Jews. Period. Therefore, there's not a Christian concept of hell in Judaism. It doesn't exist. So you'll hear a lot of times Jews will say, well, we don't have hell. And that's true. There is, however, a place called Gehinnom that we go to be cleansed of our sins. It is not a pleasant experience, right? The amount of unpleasantness is directly proportional to the sins that you've committed. But it's not an eternal place. The closest thing that we could parallel it to would be purgatory. It's not identical to a Christian concept of purgatory, but it's the closest idea. And from a Jewish perspective, the maximum amount of time that anyone can spend in Gehinnom is 1 year. And that is if you are the worst of the worst of the worst, right? We'll get to what happens if you do certain things that are unforgivable, but they're still not eternal torment. After whatever time you spend in Gehinnom, then you go to Olam Haba, which is the world to come. One of the other major differences between Judaism and Christianity is the only way to heaven for Christians is through Jesus. In Judaism, the only way to heaven is not through the commandments. As a matter of fact, if you are Jewish, and this may shock those people who are converting to Judaism, it's something that we talk about as part of the conversion process. If you're Jewish, you need to keep 613 commandments, right? That's how many we have within our tradition. If you are not Jewish, you only need to keep 7 Noahide, what are called the 7 Noahide laws, which are basic laws of humanity. Don't murder, don't steal, don't rip a limb from a living animal, i.e. cruelty to animals, create a system of government so there's not anarchy, right? Certain basic levels of humanity, that's it. And then you, as a non-Jew, are in Olam Haba, the world to come, right alongside the Jews. It's actually easier. Now, what's interesting, what I would say is that from a Jewish perspective, the ability to do the commandments and to have that intimate relationship with God through the commandments is seen as a gift, not a burden. Sometimes a burden, but usually a gift. All right, Nancy, I see your hand up.
How can there be a concept of time when you're dead? I mean, to be
Well, look,
staying there 1 year.
if you feel that time is a relative construct, then no, you're not going to have a concept of time. But we believe in Judaism that time is a construct that God has constructed, and therefore time can be can go be after you're dead as well. If God is the ultimate timekeeper, it's not dependent on me, it's dependent on God. Does that make sense? Maybe.
I mean, is it really ever talked about in the Torah?
No, because the assumption was that the time, time was never talked about, other than creation was already in terms of time. 7 days.
Well, and the Jews wandered for 40 years in the desert.
Right. No. But what I'm saying is, before humans, there was time.
Mm-hmm.
Because God talked about it in first day, second day, third day.
Okay.
So time is not human dependent. It may be relative if you believe Einstein, but it's not human dependent.
Well, there's also, in the recounting of generations of people and the tribes, there's lots of mention of how many years people lived.
Yeah, look, once human beings are here, clearly time is there. But I would argue that even before humans, there was time. There was day and night. There was light and dark, and there was times of days and years and things like that.
Right, but the times that are mentioned are widely very. They're all different. They're very large numbers. So
Yes.
They kind of don't make much sense anyway.
Well, we don't know. So some people argue that the time is different. Some people argue that no, people just lived that long at that time. And then as we got, later, that we started to live shorter and shorter periods of time. Okay. So we've talked about 4 major distinctions between Judaism and Christianity. And I will argue, by the way, that there's more similarities than there are differences. Most of who we are, and I mentioned this last week, that, when I was talking with my Catholic priest friend, a lot of our foundational ideas and values, they're all the same. They're all the same. But these 4, and then you add the messianic concept, these 5 concepts are the major differences between Judaism and Christianity, and they all actually make it incompatible to be both. You can't both believe in the unity of God the way that we do as Jews and believe in the Trinity. That's incompatible. You can't both believe in heaven and hell in the Christian formulation and say, oh, actually, we don't have a concept of eternal damnation. Those are incompatible. All of these 5 are incompatible. The other things, yeah, sometimes there are gaps, and sometimes there are things that we do things differently, right? But it's the way that it's the baggage that we put around it that makes it different. The act is actually the same. So let's take mikvah and baptism. Same act. But it's what we do around it that makes it different. The intentionality behind the act that's going to make it different, right? A baptism is a statement of belief in Jesus and an acceptance of that, and therefore being born again, that new life, right? That brings you. Mikvah is also new life, but it has nothing to do with belief in Jesus. Okay, so those are the main issues. I actually am going to leave questions, and then just next week we'll talk about Judaism and other religions. It'll be a very action-packed class. So I encourage you to be here on time, because we're going to start right away. We're going to do about 20 minutes for each religion: Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam. Next time. So it's not obviously going to be in depth, but we'll go through it and see again where the major differences lie. But I really wanted to now open it up and to allow for a little bit of conversation, because for most people, especially if you're in the conversion program, you're thinking about that, the world you come from is a Christian world, and this is big. You know, I'll share with you. You know, many of you know me. You know, I spent a lot of time as a chaplain, hospital chaplain. Chaplains have a tendency of trying to get to the heart of a matter, or the emotion right behind it. And I remember when I first got here. I'll tell you this story, and then I'll open it up for questions. When I first got here, it was within the first 3 or 4 years of me being here. And I was working with conversion candidates. Rabbi Zuckerman was still here, but I was doing the training and the work, and then he would come in at the end and sort of help orchestrate the Beit Din and all of that. And I was working with a woman who came from a Catholic background, and she was really excited, a real go-getter. She was dating somebody who was Jewish. They wanted to get married. She's like, I'm ready. I'm ready right now, you know. Let's, you know, whatever you need me to do, I'm ready to be Jewish. And I felt like there needed to be an acknowledgement of the gravity of the decision that she was making. And so I said to her, I said, okay. I said, that's amazing. It's amazing to hear. There's only one thing that you need to do then. And she actually got quite excited, and she said, what? I said, you need to give up salvation. And her face just went white. Because from a Christian perspective, that's what's going on. And for those of you who have family members who are Christian, and especially if they are religious, that's the concern that they have. And they may be very happy for you as a human being, and as the family member that you're happy and you found somebody and you're finding a religion and all of that. But if they're religious, there is that concern in them that you're giving up salvation and you're going to go to hell. And we have to deal with that. Now, the response is, well, there's a couple responses. The response that I don't feel is helpful often is to say, well, we don't believe in that, and you're wrong. That doesn't usually get us anywhere. But A response that tends to work a little bit more if you have family members that are open to conversation is, look, I understand that you're scared for me, and I get it, but magnificent is the ways of God, and there are many paths to salvation. I found a different path, right? And for some people, that gives them a little bit of peace, even though deep down they're still very concerned about that. So these are big deals, right? These are big deals. And as we talk about it, and as we work together, especially if you come from a Christian background, these are things to really talk about, because, as I said, belief in Jesus as a personal savior is incompatible with being Jewish. And therefore, if you're going to make that leap, that's going to be something that you're going to step away from. And we need to talk through that. We need to think about that and make sure that you feel good and confident and okay with that. Okay, I'm done talking. I'm going to open it up for questions now. I saw a lot of nodding heads and stuff like that. So let's open it up, and we've got a few minutes, like at least 10 minutes until I need to jump off for the next class. So what do we think? What's our reaction to this lesson and to what I've been talking about?
I have a question.
Okay. Brian, I see you now. Okay.
Brian, yes. Relating to the difference in terms of atonement. So in Judaism, if you sin against another person, you have to seek atonement from them. Does it matter if they are willing or unwilling to forgive you?
Well, it obviously matters, because it's hard to seek atonement if somebody is unwilling to forgive you. But Judaism does actually have a response to that. And our tradition says that you need to go and genuinely try to make things better and ask for forgiveness on three times. And if after the third time the person is still unwilling, the sin actually moves off of you and moves on to them for being unforgiving.
Okay.
Right? Now it has to be genuine. And by the way, I mean, let's have a real conversation for a moment. There are things that are unforgivable. Right?
Right.
We have to deal with that. And if we talk about abuse, and there's all sorts of things that are unforgivable. Like, you can't say, oh, well, you should forgive your rapist. And by the way, there are people who have, right? But that's something that is a very difficult thing to do. And so there's a recognition of that. So there's the ideal, and then there's reality. Neil.
I was going to ask you the difference, if you could repeat, between the Jewish concept of, quote, Satan, and the Christian concept. You mentioned there's a God and we can only have one.
And prosecutor, but I don't know what the prosecutor meant. Does a prosecutor mean the Jewish Satan is like saying you've done bad things, and I'm going to bring them up, and I'm challenging you? Okay, so basically he's, kind of, he's on your shoulder saying you've done bad stuff.
If you want to see the true role of Satan in Judaism, read the book of Job, right? Because the book of Job is all about, God is actually saying, my servant Job, he's the best, he's the most amazing, he's the most faithful servant I've ever had, right? And Satan kind of comes and says, really? Like, you've given him everything, he's got every benefit, maybe if he were suffering, would he still be as faithful to you? And so God said, okay, well, let's see. And then Satan is allowed to have these things happen to Job, and these suffering happen, and Job still stays faithful until the very, very end, and Job then rails out against God, and God answers back. But Satan can't do anything by himself. Satan can't just come, and in Christianity, Satan is a autonomous figure. Satan is actually causing trouble, causing you to stumble. right? In Judaism, Satan isn't causing you to stumble. Satan is just holding the mirror up to you when you do.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Marge, I saw your hand go up and then back down again. I don't know if I answered your question or.
I can't formulate my question in a way to ask
Oh,
yet.
okay. When you do, let me know.
Okay.
Neil, is your hand back up again, or was that from before?
Yeah, no, somebody brought up the idea of unforgivable. So what
Mhm.
happens, like just pick murder? That's probably unforgivable. What happens to you when it's time for your cleansing, or however you want to put it?
Yeah, so there are certain things that Jewish tradition says are unforgivable. Interestingly enough, murder isn't necessarily one of them, right? I mean, there murder from passion and things like that. Like there's things that ultimately you're gonna have to pay for, but you might be able to be cleansed of and forgiven for. But leaving out which sins are on that list, if you do one of those on the list, the Jewish response is not one of eternal damnation. Instead, it's actually one of oblivion, right? So the soul, we said, is eternal. The soul, we said, is a divine spark. We talked about that early on. And if you are somebody who has done one of these things that you cannot go on to Olam Haba, to the world to come, then your soul ceases to exist. But there's not it's not an eternal torment, the way that the Christian world or Christianity sees it.
That's a good answer.
Mm-hmm. Elliot.
Yeah. So, you gave the concept of 1 year, that no matter what the sin is, even the worst sins, but the soul doesn't do anything in that 1 year. It just is a time period.
No, the soul is in Gehinnom and is being cleansed. And there are, depending on what time period we look at, if you look in the Middle Ages, when Dante was writing his Inferno, the Jewish rabbis picked up on that and has some of those sorts of things that are going on as well. And so it's very unpleasant, but it's not eternal. It's a punishment. And the punishment fits the crime. But it's not eternal. And what's interesting, and I'll sort of leave it with this, what's interesting is that our tradition actually says, well, yeah, the maximum time is a year, but nobody's really that bad. And therefore, the maximum time is really 11 months. Now, what's the 11-month number that is important to us in Judaism? Anybody know? Rona was nodding her head.
Gotta do this.
The morning time for a child?
How
Well,
long you say Kaddish?
Yeah, it's how long you say Kaddish, actually for parents, but it's how long you say Kaddish. And those two are correlated. So that while it's possible for your parent's soul to be in Gehinnom, you're saying Kaddish. You're reminding God, right? This is where grace comes in. You're reminding God to be forgiving and to go, to allow for that to go quickly. And so that's why we say Kaddish traditionally for 11 months. It corresponds with this particular philosophical belief. All right, anybody else? All right, so next week we are going to have a crash course on Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. And I do not purport to be an expert on any of them, nor do I purport to be an expert on Christianity, by the way. I'm an expert on Judaism, but what I'm going to try to show you is where the differences are between those ideas and those religions and our Jewish tradition. Okay. All right, everyone. Have a great. Oh, I will say to you, by the way, anyone who is converting, anyone who has people who have converted or know, I really encourage you to listen to Rabbi Ernst and my podcast for this week. If you haven't heard it, it specifically talks about the role of people who are not Jewish in our community and in the larger community by looking at the figure of Yitro, of Jethro, who was Moses' father-in-law and a Midianite priest. And for those who are converting to Judaism and will have family that remains not Jewish, I think it's a very instructive portion to think about. So I highly recommend you listen to it. You can go to our website, betham.com, and in the religious life section, there's a section on podcasts, and just look at this week's. It's for Yitro. It's only about 12 minutes or so. So I highly recommend you listen to that as we go forward.
Rabbi, we listened to it and it was great.
I'm glad. Thank you. See, I've got a good sponsor here.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Todah.